that deals with schizophrenia. Now, this is a very controversial artwork because there's a ongoing debate about the artist Lewis Wayne. Okay, there are some people who claim that his later artwork shows signs of schizophrenia. Okay, whereas he became very famous for these anthropomorphized cats. He was drawing all these cartoons, and it relates to his wife because his wife was dying of cancer and their tomcat really comforted her. So he started drawing a bunch of pictures of cats. And then they claim that over the period of his career, these paintings got much, much more abstract and much more in line with symptoms of schizophrenia. However, counter arguments to this theory argue that he didn't do these paintings in this particular order, but they were more mixed up. So not necessarily showing symptoms of schizophrenia. Okay, but this does kind of show this detachment from reality and the kind of psychosis symptoms that can occur in suffering from schizophrenia. In fact, if y'all go to the Schoology page, and this is what I want y'all to do for homework, okay? If you go into the lecture series for this unit, for Unit 8, and you scroll down to the big font that says experience what it's like to be a person with schizophrenia. Okay, this is a very short video that I always watch with my students that just goes through what a person with schizophrenia may be experiencing throughout the day. So you're going to see paranoia, you're going to see delusions, both auditory and visual delusions, and just this paranoia over a threat or a potential factor of harm in that day-to-day life. Okay, so what's reality starts changing in front of your eyes. So you can't always trust what you see, especially as people with schizophrenia do have a tendency to stop their medication after a period of time because they believe that this disorder is handled or that it's in remission or that it's gone away. But schizophrenia is something that doesn't simply go away. So in terms of the onset of schizophrenia, okay, 1% of the world population suffers from this disorder, and typically it's going to emerge between the ages of 18 to 24 years old. That's the average, okay? So me, I'm past that date, okay? I'm 28 years old, so I'm pretty sure that the onset of schizophrenia is not something that I am going to have to worry about in particular. Now, in terms of gender, it does affect both genders equally in terms of the number of people who have schizophrenia in the world. However, men tend to suffer more severe delusions and more severe symptoms. Okay, now what's the reason for that? Well, it could be that there are gender differences biologically that are resulting in men suffering from more severe symptoms, or it could be gender roles, okay, the sociocultural model that is playing a role in sufferers of this disorder. For instance, women have a tendency to seek medical care much more often than men do. It's part of the reason that women have a longer life expectancy. Okay, so if a woman goes to the doctor, that's more likely that her symptoms are going to be addressed and she is going to get treatment for her symptoms sooner than a man might. And so the sooner you get treatment for schizophrenia, the longer you can go without symptoms, or the symptoms don't get as severe. Untreated schizophrenia, okay, can lead to very, very severe symptoms. So if you go through a long period of time without going to the doctor and you don't know that you're having delusions or paranoia or that reality is shifting, okay, then it's only going to continue to get worse. So it may be that yes, men and women are both susceptible to schizophrenia, but due to sociocultural models, women are more likely to go to the doctor and have that caught sooner rather than later. Are we good so far? All right, so where do we get the term schizophrenia? Well, schizophrenia is a literal term that means split mind. Okay, now this can get confusing because a lot of people will think, oh, split personalities, multiple personality disorder, or DID, that's different. Okay, what they mean by split mind, it doesn't mean, oh, we have a bunch of different personalities. It means that you're splitting from reality. Okay. And so the more severe symptoms of this disorder are going to include disorganized and delusional thinking. This could be like word salad, where you're not able to speak coherently, or you have grandiose beliefs like you're the president of the United States or someone's out to kill you. Disturbed perceptions. This is when you may hear things or see things that aren't actually there. So kind of like hearing voices in your head. Inappropriate emotions and actions. Okay, that could mean a complete lack of the expression of emotions, like a flat affect, or it could be like a symptom called waxy flexibility, where some people with schizophrenia have negative symptoms, meaning that a behavior that's supposed to be there is absent. So some people with schizophrenia that are in long-term care facilities suffer from waxy flexibility, which means that they will sit or stand in a position for hours on end, completely unmoving. And even if someone tries to move them, like if I'm sitting here with that symptom and they lift my arm up like this, then I will stay in that position. I will hold it like a mannequin, okay, or a wax doll. Okay, so there are going to be positive symptoms and negative symptoms. Positive symptoms don't mean good. It just means the presence of inappropriate behaviors. Negative symptoms doesn't mean bad. It means the absence of appropriate behaviors. So something that's supposed to be there isn't, or something that's not supposed to be there is. Okay, so some positive symptoms of schizophrenia can include hallucinations and delusions and disorganized speech. Trace brought up this symptom in a previous class when we were talking about the Unit 8 project, referential thinking. This is when you make connections to things that aren't connected. So like ascribing personal meaning to completely random events. So like if you see a black cat walk in front of you and you say, oh, I need to go back to the house because something bad's going to happen, that's referential thinking. There's no connection between that cat and what kind of day you're going to have. Okay, but yet you find a connection. That's a positive symptom. Okay, in terms of disorganized speech, some people with schizophrenia will talk completely incoherently, and you cannot they're saying real words, okay, but they make no sense together. Okay, and we're going to look at some examples of that. And then in terms of negative symptoms, a flat affect, not having any emotions on your face, or catatonia. All right, this is where we get the waxy flexibility of they'll sit or stand or stare into the distance for hours on end. They can be moved by somebody else, but then they'll stay in that position for hours on end. Are we good on this slide? So first we're going to go over the positive symptoms. Okay, first category being hallucinations. So a person with schizophrenia will see or hear things that may not actually be there. Okay, now most of these hallucinations are going to be auditory. They're going to be hearing things that aren't there. The most common one being voices. So like voices in their head that don't actually exist. Then to a much, much smaller degree, some people with schizophrenia do have visual hallucinations where they'll see things that aren't there, or they'll feel things like bugs on them that aren't there, or smell toast or gas, or be able to taste things. So that's to a much, much lesser degree. The most frequent symptom with hallucinations is that they're going to hear something that's not there. Does anyone need this slide? In terms of delusions, okay, so hallucinations are false perceptions. You're thinking that something's there when it's not. A delusion is a false belief. Okay, so this isn't like, oh, I heard somebody say, or I see that thing move, or the walls move, or whatever. This is a false belief that often categorizes itself as a delusion of persecution or delusions of grandeur. Okay, so a delusion of persecution could be like one example I've heard in my classes when I was in college was a man with schizophrenia believed that Smurfette was trying to kill him. So he was racing, y'all know the Smurfs, right? So he was racing down the interstate trying to get away from Smurfette. Okay, so like imagining that Mickey Mouse is trying to kill you, that's a delusion of persecution. Imagining that the government is watching your every move and they've hacked into your house and they've bugged your phone, that's a delusion of persecution. Okay, it's not based in reality. It is a false belief. Okay, that you're getting microchipped with the vaccine, that's a delusion of persecution. Okay, delusion of grandeur are kind of like narcissistic beliefs, like the belief that you're more important than you actually are. And that's not like throwing shade, like, oh, someone has a high opinion of themselves, but something that's just not possible. Okay, like people who claim that they are Jesus, okay, that they're a reincarnation of Jesus, and they start cults, or they're like, I am the king of America. And it's like, no, America doesn't have a king. Or I'm the president of the United States. It's like, no, you're not. You're someone with schizophrenia in a facility. Okay, but that's a different delusion or a false belief than the delusion of persecution. Okay, so one example here is this morning when I was at Hillside Hospital, I was making a movie. I was surrounded by movie stars. I'm Mary Poppins. That's a delusion of grandeur. Okay, they're not saying that Mary Poppins is trying to kill them. Okay, they're saying that I am Mary Poppins, and it's just not true. Is this room painted blue to get me upset? That's a delusion of persecution. Someone purposely painting a room to mess with them. Okay, to paint it blue so that they'll get upset about it for whatever reason. Okay, my grandmother died 4 weeks after my 18th birthday. So it has nothing to do with what's going on. So there we see examples of both delusions of persecution as well as delusions of grandeur. Are we good so far? Okay. Disorganized speech. This is interesting, okay, because this is when they're able to speak words. You can tell what the words are, but they make absolutely no sense, even with context. So like colorless green ideas sleep furiously. That's an example of word salad. It's completely disorganized. It doesn't make sense to anybody. Now, people believe that this symptom may occur because of your selective attention not working. So you're holding one thought and then your attention is diverted to something else. And then your attention is diverted to something else. So like you may be thinking like, oh, water is colorless. And then you're distracted by, oh, what are colors? Green is a color. And you're like, well, what is green? Green is an idea. And then like, what do you have an idea of? I have an idea to sleep. Okay, you got woken up that one time by your neighbor. That made me furious. Okay, so that goes into colorless green ideas sleep furiously. And it's just like, there's no connection between that because your selective attention is bouncing back and forth too quickly. So people can't keep up. So all of those are positive symptoms. It's important to remember, positive doesn't mean good. Positive means that there are symptoms that should not be there, behaviors that should not be there, but they are. Hallucinations should not be there, but they are. Delusions should not be there, but they are. Word salad shouldn't be there, but it is. That's different from negative symptoms. Negative symptoms is where there's supposed to be a behavior, but it's absent. Okay, so flat affect. Y'all may remember that when we talked about emotions, that an affect is an emotion. It's not the noun or the verb that you're thinking of, like effect versus affect something. Okay, it's talking about emotion. So if you have a flat affect, that means you have no emotions showing on your face. Okay, it could also be an appropriate affect. Okay, so if you show no emotion, that's flat. If you show inappropriate emotions at the wrong time, like laughing at a funeral or crying at a funny movie, okay, that would be an appropriate affect. So it's negative because it's there and it's negative because it's not there. Normal sets of emotions are not present. Are we good so far? The more severe or noticeable negative symptom of schizophrenia is catatonia. Okay, so this can include patients continually rubbing an arm, doing repetitive behavior, rocking back and forth. So that's something that we see portrayed over and over in media with people who are institutionalized, that they're just like going back and forth like this over and over again, or being completely motionless, not just like for a few minutes, but for hours or days at a time. Okay, so like here we see this position with a man in a wheelchair reaching out with one arm to touch the floor and the other arm to reach up behind him. Okay, staying in that position for hours. Okay, and that can be particularly problematic for your muscle system or for survival. Okay, and so people with those sorts of severe symptoms of schizophrenia often will require full-time care, even with the use of medications, especially as they get older and the symptoms of schizophrenia progress. Are we good so far? Okay. Then when we get back Tuesday, because y'all are going to test on Monday, we'll pick up with the symptoms of different branches of schizophrenia. There's disorganized, there's paranoid, there's catatonic, and there's undifferentiated. The most common one that we're familiar with is paranoid schizophrenia. That's the one that's going to be portrayed in media most often. But what I want y'all to do for the remaining 5 minutes in the class is I want you to go to the lecture series, click on the Unit 8 folder, lecture series, and then scroll down until you get to the YouTube video that categorizes the symptoms of schizophrenia. So this is like a case study where it's going to say, okay, this is what a person with schizophrenia is likely to experience. So it's going to be from the point of view of you watching that video. Does anyone have any questions, comments, or concerns before we dismiss for today? No problem, NJ. All right, then I hope that y'all have a wonderful rest of your day and you enjoy your lunch, but first watch that video. It is worth it. So I had y'all watch this video of a case study with schizophrenia where it went through what it's like to experience those both positive and negative symptoms. So y'all may remember that positive and negative doesn't mean good and bad. Okay, positive and negative means they're present or they're absent. So positive symptoms are things like delusions of grandeur or persecution, where you have beliefs that aren't true that are present. And negative symptoms are when you have something that's missing, like a flat affect, like you're lacking emotion. That's a negative symptom. Or you're catatonic and you're not moving. That's a negative symptom. Okay, so what were some of the symptoms that y'all remember from this case study, from this video, that were striking to you?
The voices.
The voices, okay, the auditory delusions. And we know that auditory delusions, or sorry, hallucinations. Auditory hallucinations are more common than visual hallucinations. So as the video started off, you were just like brushing your teeth, you lost a little bit of time, there were some bright lights, and then you start hearing voices from the TV. At first, it's the weatherman who's just talking about the weather. And then he starts saying, they know what you did and they're going to find you. Like some of y'all are looking at me like you didn't watch the video. So go back and watch that if you haven't. And so you start hearing these voices that are like they're from the TV, and like even the what you're seeing in newspapers, like the wording changes and it all becomes a threat. Okay, so you see delusions of persecution, that they will know what you did and they are coming to get you. A pizza man arrives at the end of the video and you're just like, I didn't order a pizza. And then these voices in your head say, they're here to kill you, or oh no, they know it's poison, don't eat it. You know, poison, poison, like over and over again. So again, that delusions of persecution. Then at the end, you see a woman, a caretaker coming by. She makes a comment, it's like, oh, you haven't been taking your medication. That's a common symptom in schizophrenia, that they'll stop taking the antipsychotics that help prevent those symptoms from occurring. And then like everything changes and they balance them back in reality. Like they open the windows and it's sunny, it's not storming, the TV isn't saying weird messages or coded messages to you, and just kind of giving you some insight into what that experience might be like with schizophrenia. Oh, I don't know if I mentioned this before. Those of you who are face-to-face, you have the option, if you want to join the Zoom, to see like directly what I'm projecting onto your screen, especially if you can't see some of the words, or if you prefer to not join the Zoom. I've already got you marked present on attendance, so you can do it either way. But I do type things in the chat, so if you want to be able to see those, then I would recommend signing in. Okay. So with that, now we're going to talk about the different categories of schizophrenia, because it's not a one size fits all. There are 4 different categories, the most well known of which is paranoid schizophrenia. That's the one that we see portrayed most often in media. This is where we get the whole delusions and hallucinations. Okay, so the person who's enacting that characteristic or stereotypical behavior of someone with a mental illness usually falls into that paranoid schizophrenia. So misinterpretation of reality. They either think that they're super important, that they're a god, or that they're some sort of like political leader or religious leader, or they think that the FBI is bugging their microwave and that Obama is listening to them through the microwave, like those sorts of delusions that have no basis in reality and often correlates with emotional agitation. So that's typically how media portrays people with schizophrenia, as extremely agitated and volatile, although that's not always the case. Okay, case in point, with catatonic schizophrenia, this doesn't have mostly positive symptoms. Paranoid schizophrenia is mostly positive. You have the addition of things that shouldn't be there. Okay, delusions that are added, hallucinations that are added. With catatonic schizophrenia, you have the absence of things that should be there, like the absence of emotion, so flat affect, or the absence of movement, entering into periods of excitability, and then losing that and going into periods of extreme isolation. So y'all may remember us talking about waxy flexibility, where the person will sit or stand in a certain position, like a mannequin, and then you can move their arm or move their leg and they will stay in whatever position that you put them in. Okay, and so that's the kind of catatonic schizophrenia category. The disorganized schizophrenia is where you see some positive symptoms in terms of inappropriate affect. So there's flat affect, which is no emotion, which is a negative symptom. And then there's inappropriate affect, which is a positive symptom, like laughing when you're not supposed to be laughing or crying when you're not supposed to be crying. Basically, some very childlike or inappropriate behavior, grinning and laughing, giggling, that sort of thing. And then maybe not paying as much attention to your personal condition, like your hygiene and things like that. So this is where we get the symptoms of word salad, the personality kind of falling apart, and just kind of nonsensical behavior. Now, if you have schizophrenia and you have symptoms from all of these categories and you can't be neatly put away into a single category of schizophrenia, that's where we get undifferentiated schizophrenia. Okay, it's not clear cut. Maybe you have canatotic phases and disorganized phases. Maybe you have extreme paranoia and delusions, but you also have waxy flexibility. Okay, so there is a category of other, for we don't have a particular designation for this yet. So it's simply undifferentiated. Are we good so far? Does anybody need this slide? All right. So what leads to schizophrenia? What are the factors that impact its effects? Well, we can say with some degree of certainty that dopamine plays a role. Y'all may remember dopamine as the pleasure chemical. It hits your nucleus accumbens, which deals with addiction, but too much dopamine can lead to hallucinations or tripping. For instance, certain drugs mimic the effects of dopamine or neurotransmitters, and that can lead to hallucinations or extreme agitation. And so dopamine is tied to those major symptoms that we see within schizophrenia. Okay, so the higher levels of dopamine receptors you have in your brain, okay, is tied to the prevalence of schizophrenia. So not necessarily just how much dopamine you have, but how many receptors you have in your neurons to receive that dopamine in the first place. So because you have so many receptors, the dopamine in your synapses is finding a place to land instead of being reabsorbed in the reuptake process. So if you were going to treat schizophrenia, which of these drugs would you prescribe? A dopamine agonist or a dopamine antagonist? and why? Y'all may remember from Unit 3 on the brain, an agonist is a drug that mimics a neurotransmitter. An antagonist is a drug that inhibits a neurotransmitter.
So wouldn't the medicine be an antagonist?
Exactly right. An antagonist would block the dopamine. Okay. What it does is it sits in the receptors. Okay. So like the antipsychotic medication that they take sits in the receptors on their neurons, preventing that dopamine from getting to their brain, from having an effect. And then eventually that dopamine is reabsorbed in the process of reuptake. Okay. So it would be an antagonist that would be the prescribed treatment for schizophrenia. In terms of what this looks like in the brain, okay, you do literally see damage to the tissue caused by schizophrenia. Okay, in terms of MRI and PET scans, we see abnormal activity in the following areas: the frontal cortex, the thalamus, and the amygdala. Now, what's your frontal cortex used for? Like your frontal lobe. Good. Critical thinking, decision making, and impulse control. Okay, so you see that with people suffering from schizophrenia, they may not be able to make decisions. They may not be able to control inhibition. So like inappropriate affect. You're not supposed to laugh or smile at a certain time, but your frontal lobe isn't restraining that behavior. So you have inappropriate behavior and expressions. Your thalamus is the relay station for your brain. Your eyes send information to your thalamus, which then sends it to your occipital lobe. Your ears send auditory information to your thalamus, which then sends it to the, there's frontal, occipital, temporal, which then sends it to the temporal lobe. So all of your senses, except for the sense of smell, goes through your thalamus. Now, how would the thalamus relate to some symptoms that we see in schizophrenia? What could be going wrong there? Exactly right. So if you're having auditory and visual hallucinations, if you're seeing and hearing things, you're perceiving things that aren't actually there in reality, then it could be tied to your thalamus mixing up those messages. It meant to send you something saying, hey, the weatherman's saying it's going to be sunny today. And then instead you start hearing vague, ominous threats coming from the TV. Okay, so a match in the thalamus, which is your relay system. What about the amygdala? How could that be affected? What does the amygdala do? Exactly right. It controls fear and aggression. Okay, so if you're having delusions of persecution, okay, that could be what's being affected. Your amygdala. You're overly afraid and overly paranoid because it keeps getting overstimulated. Are we good so far? Also, some other physical indications of schizophrenia include tissue loss in the brain. So here we see a change in loss in adolescence. So here's a neurotypical adolescent without schizophrenia. Here's a neurodivergent brain with schizophrenia. And you can see the parts of the brain that have the highest rate of loss in that tissue. So near the top of the cortex into the frontal lobe, and then in the temporal lobe next to the ears. So this would make sense why we're seeing auditory hallucinations be more prevalent than visual hallucinations, because your occipital lobe would be more in the back of the brain. And it's mostly the top and the bottom that's being affected here. You also see the enlargement of ventricles in the brain. Okay, these are fluid-filled spaces. It's not brain tissue, it's just an empty space. Now, does that mean it's empty of everything? No, there's cerebral spinal fluid, but there's no physical brain mass in that area. Okay, so we see a neurotypical brain on the left with much smaller ventricles than the neurodivergent brain on the right, which has a much larger ventricle, showing deterioration of the brain tissue and showing a smaller prefrontal cortex, which can relate to the lack of impulse control that we see in certain types of schizophrenia. Okay, does anyone need this slide? Okay, good deal. So we've talked about signs of schizophrenia. Okay, we've talked about like, oh, well, there's dopamine in your brain, but what causes the extra receptors? Or they say there's brain loss in terms of tissue damage, but what causes the tissue damage? So this doesn't really tell us about the etiology of schizophrenia. How does it occur in the first place? We're just simply looking at the effects of it. Well, some studies have found that it can relate to the prenatal environment, most notably a viral infection in the middle of fetal development. So say around the second trimester, if someone who is pregnant gets the flu or a cold, okay, there is a higher correlation with the development of schizophrenia in that child later in that child's adolescence or early adulthood. Okay, so if you contract the flu during that second trimester, you see a higher correlation in schizophrenia. So somehow that viral infection leads to prenatal changes in the fetus's brain that makes more receptors for dopamine and thus results in this onset of schizophrenia once they hit puberty. So that's very interesting to think about in terms of what we're going through in the middle of a viral pandemic. So if the flu can do this and colds can do this, we're just now seeing the first round of babies who are being born from the COVID pandemic. So it'll be interesting to see the longitudinal studies for if there are any causal links between this particular virus and things like schizophrenia. Did you have a question, baby?
Oh.
Okay, sorry, I thought you were about to ask something. Are we good so far? All right. Other genetic factors, obviously, when it comes to twin studies, identical twins versus fraternal twins, you're going to see more of that nature element with the identical twins, because with identical twins, they share the same genetic code, not just the same parents, but the exact same DNA. With fraternal twins, it's the same as any brother or sister. Okay, so it's not the exact same egg that is split apart and was fertilized by the exact same sperm. It's different eggs and different sperm, therefore completely different genetics. They just have the same parents. So if you have a higher rate in identical twins sharing the same comorbidities versus fraternal twins or just random siblings, that's a weird way to say it, then you can see that there is a genetic factor in whatever it is that you're studying. So particularly in schizophrenia, you have a 50% higher chance of having schizophrenia if your identical twin also has it. And in terms of other family members, if you are the child of two people who also have schizophrenia, okay, then you're at almost a high rate as if your identical twin had schizophrenia, versus looking at the general population of like around 1%. So from 1 to around 41%. Okay, depending on your relation to that person. But the early onset of schizophrenia is typically going to be like in y'all's age group until around 24. Once you get past that 24 mark, then it's a lot less likely for you to experience those symptoms. Yes, baby.
Isn't there like the girl February or something that her name was like February? It was like a
Oh, I haven't heard.
I don't know. Well, she had it and it was like really bad. And then her brother
Mhm.
watched her and stuff. Yeah, but like they weren't. I mean, they were saying like 2 years like experience how that was her.
That must have been interesting because it's almost like scary seeing what could occur.
Yeah,
So
she was like beat up on her brother.
so she would be paranoid schizophrenic.
Yeah, I think that's
Yeah. Their name was February?
or
January? One of the months.
What's
So-
that month? I know.
Yeah, there's only 12, narrow it down. So yeah, like you see, like with regular children, it's under 10% chance. It's like a 1 in 10. But then when it goes up to identical twin, it's a 1 in or 4 out of 10 chance of having schizophrenia. If any of y'all watch Criminal Minds, Spencer Reed, his mother has schizophrenia. And so for a while, he was afraid that he also would develop it until he was past the age when it typically has an onset. Like there's one season where he had these blinding headaches and he was just like, this is it, it's the schizophrenia. And it just turned out to be something else that was psychosomatic.
How far are you in that position?
I'm on the last season, the one that's on Hulu. I think it's 13, the one where Rossi's hair goes white.
Well,
There are 15? I hear they're starting a new one. They're like bringing it back. Yeah, on CBS.
I've only seen, I think there's
Oh yeah. I finished all the Netflix. Now I'm on Hulu. So I gotta have commercials. Yeah, baby. Uh-huh.
And her name was January, and she was 11 years old. She was like one of the youngest children ever to be treated. She was 7 when she had it.
What?
And so, and it says, this was like, and then her brother who was 6,
Mhm.
though not officially diagnosed with schizophrenia, had violent outbursts and like self-harm.
Did she have early onset puberty?
Doesn't say.
That is interesting because it's
Yeah,
usually,
there's a TV show about, or like the movie or something about it. I remember watching it.
I'll have to watch that then, or I'll add it to the list for y'all's project.
Maybe not.
Yeah, send that an email to me with the name. You're just like someone disinterested, like, yeah, you could, I guess, and whatever. You can add it to our work. But you get to pick whichever movie. I would probably do Split.
Yeah,
It was such a good movie.
I've seen Split.
Yeah. Yeah, or The Silence of the Lambs with psychopaths. Like that would be interesting. I think. As all the movies I've already seen. All right, it is really good. Yeah, had a friend who didn't know that it was a part of a trilogy.
I still
Like-
have almost seen it.
Yeah, I haven't seen Unbreakable, but I've seen Split and I've seen Glass, both of which I saw in theaters. Remember when we used to go to theaters?
I know.
Yes, like used to be a
It was just
thing.
Funny because my friend was like, "This is what we're watching." I had no clue what it was.
Mhm.
And she turned it on, and I was like, "Wait, this is like a horror movie. Why are we watching this?"
Because I need to feel something.
And I'm just like, I'm not a horror person
Uh-huh.
personally, and she just turned it on, and I was like, "I guess I have to watch it now."
Peer pressured into watching scary movies. And I saw It Too recently, and it wasn't really that scary.
It looks
Yeah, probably. That's always true. All right, y'all.
not great.
Yeah, it's kind of like the cursed child in Harry Potter. It's like, but I still have it. So in terms of nature versus nurture, we have an actual case study of identical quadruplets. Okay. They're identical quadruplets that all have schizophrenia, but they have different schizophrenia. So we can account for nature. All of them have the exact same genetic code. They're quadruplets, they're identical. Okay, however, all of them have various symptoms or versions of schizophrenia. So I'm going to read this aloud for y'all. Interestingly, the expression of schizophrenia was very different between the quadruplets. Myra, after an initial episode, was never hospitalized and is married. Nora was hospitalized repeatedly, but had marginal adjustment while outside the hospital. Iris experienced more chronic hospitalization, and her symptoms range from severe catatonic withdrawal to times of marginal adjustment when she was able to leave the hospital. And Hester further deteriorated and remains hospitalized. The case study shows that the same genes for schizophrenia can lead to very diverse outcomes, though all quadruplets did develop schizophrenia. The family environment, including parenting skills, were the same for all 4, although parents may have treated them differently. However, a difference in treatment is mostly due to the kids being different. So the parents react to the difference of the child. So this relates directly to the diathesis or diathesis stress model. Does anyone remember that hypothesis for how disorders develop? That equation for disorders? Yeah, some of y'all honest, you're like, no, I've never heard of it. All right, so we did lecture on it. So diathesis is your genetic predisposition. Let's say that my family has a history of alcoholism. So I know that I am predisposed to alcoholism. So it's up here in terms of my diathesis. Now, is it a disorder yet? No, I just have a predisposition. But let's say I go through a stressor. I lose my job. That predisposition plus the stressor can trigger a disorder. Okay, let's say that I'm not predisposed to alcoholism, but I go through an extreme trauma, okay, like a car wreck or something. Then my stressor was enough to reach the threshold of disorder, even though my diathesis was not high enough. So the higher your predisposition, the lower amount of stress you need to trigger that disorder. Now, there's another part of this equation called protective factors. Let's say I have a high predisposition for alcoholism. I have high stress, but I have a good support network. Okay, that can lower that threshold, or sorry, it can lower the chances of me meeting that threshold and triggering that disorder. So it's predisposition, your genetics, plus stress minus protective factors. Does that or does that not equal the threshold necessary for a disorder? Okay, so this explains why some people can go through the exact same traumatic event and deal with it differently. Okay, does that make sense so far? Also makes sense with this case study. Okay, these quadruplets all have the same genetic code, but they could have gone through very different experiences in their lives, maybe being married or unmarried, completing high school or not completing high school, the way their parents treated them. Okay, and so this helps us look further into the nature versus nurture aspect of psychology. Are we good? So how do we treat schizophrenia? Well, obviously you're going to have the biomedical approach, but also a therapeutic approach. Some of them can be more extreme, like psychosurgery, trying to cut off the connections to your thalamus or your corpus callosum that leads to those positive symptoms. But kind of like with lobotomies, it's a lot more rare to have that kind of psychosurgery. And I'm not an expert on it, so I'm not going to try and speak on it too much. Behavioral therapy, trying to encourage certain behaviors like consistent taking of medications. So to do this, you create a token economy. What this means is you create something of value to that person. Okay, like if they use it all the time in classrooms, like you're in a classroom and every time you make an A, you get a sticker on your test. Or if you get enough AR points, you get to exchange it for a gift. Okay, so you take something that has no value and you give it value. So rewarding behavior in order to make that behavior more common, such as with taking your medications consistently. In terms of the biomedical approach, the most common medicine that's prescribed, was it time? Okay, I got you. So the most common approach is going to be the prescribing of antipsychotic medication. That can include thorazine or haloperidol. What this does is it inhibits your neurotransmitter of dopamine from being absorbed to the brain. These antipsychotic medications sit in your receptors to prevent dopamine from getting the messages into your brain. Because remember, like we said before, schizophrenia is linked to having too much dopamine and too many receptors, thus leading to psychosis. Now, the drawback to this, okay, and there is a negative side to this. The drawback to taking antipsychotic medications is that prolonged use of it can lead to facial tics and involuntary twitching. Okay, this is called tardive dyskinesia. Okay, so repetitive and involuntary movements in your hands or your face or your neck, okay, something that you cannot control because of the use of antipsychotics over such a long period of time. However, the risk of taking the medication outweighs the risk of not taking the medication, because schizophrenia left untreated will only continue to spiral into full-blown psychosis, mania, and other behaviors that are not conducive to adjustment in society. Does that make sense so far? Good deal. Then we've done schizophrenia. Now we're going to move on to personality disorders. And there are 10 personality disorders. We're going to go through each of these in detail, but this is just to give you a real quick recap of what we're about to cover. First, we have paranoid personality disorder. This isn't full on break from reality or psychosis like you see with schizophrenia, but it's still a constant worry or a constant feeling of people being against you, which can kind of get in the way of your interpersonal relationship. So the thing with these personality disorders is that they are consistent behavior patterns. It's not just like, oh, one time you didn't trust this guy because you didn't know him. It's persistent and consistent across the board. Okay. And it is making it so that your social interactions and interpersonal relationships don't flourish. So this isn't like, oh, one time a person steals a tube of lipstick from CVS, they must be histrionic personality disorder or something. This is something that's over a long period of time and it's unchangeable. Okay, so with personality disorders, it's not like, oh, you can cure it. It's more so you can treat it. Particularly when we talk about antisocial personality disorder. Okay, this deals with sociopaths and psychopaths. They lack the ability to feel other people's emotions. They lack the ability to feel empathy. They lack the ability to really inherently know the difference between right and wrong. Okay, they know this is good for me or this is bad for me, or this feels good or it doesn't feel good. They don't think about this is bad for someone else or this might hurt somebody else. Okay, now just because someone has antisocial personality disorder does not mean that they're going to be a violent psychopath or that they're going to commit violent crimes. We do have a higher rate of sociopaths and psychopaths in jail, but we also have a very high rate of sociopaths in just day-to-day society, often filling roles as CEOs or other prominent businessmen. They have a lot of charisma. They don't have a lot of moral quandaries when it comes to, doing whatever it takes to get ahead. And so some of that behavior is actually beneficial to them economically. So just because someone has antisocial personality disorder doesn't necessarily mean, oh, they're going to murder me and eat my brain, right? That's more so in like the psychopath level of violent criminals who feel a need or an urge to complete those sorts of actions. Okay, so if you're interested in watching like Silence of the Lamb for your project, that's where this would fall in with the antisocial personality disorder. The histrionic personality disorder is kind of gender biased. I always put histrionic and narcissistic personality disorders together, but typically women tend to be diagnosed with histrionic personality disorder and men tend to be diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder. With histrionic personality disorder, a person tends to be very dramatic, very excessively emotional. They want to be the center of attention all the time, and they may be sexually provocative or inappropriate. Narcissistic personality disorder is, I am God, you should treat me like I'm God. I'm more important and special than everybody else, okay? Borderline personality disorder, people often confuse with bipolar disorder. Borderline personality disorder is when you go through those rapid cycles. You could be like very, very affectionate 1 hour, and then the next hour you're very distant and cold, or you can be very happy and active, and then the next you're angry and like yelling. That's where we get the borderline personality disorder. Schizoid personality disorder is when you have an extreme lack in interpersonal relationships. You don't want to communicate with anybody. You don't want to have a partner. You just want to be by yourself and people leave you alone. The kind of like, get off my lawn sort of mentality. The schizotypal is the less severe version of that. That's where you're socially isolated, but also like a little bit eccentric. So think like a hermit in the woods or like a wizard or something where they just be like a little bit off and they don't actively seek out other people, but it's not necessarily like I can't have any contact with anyone ever. Avoidant personality disorder, it's going to relate to having a lot of feelings of shame and anxiety and inadequacy. So very, very low self-esteem. So they'll try to avoid relationships or avoid interactions with others because of that. Dependent personality disorder is when we get codependent relationships. The dependent personality disorders and the antisocial personality disorders kind of like draw themselves together. Also like narcissistic personality disorder, because a dependent personality disorder sees themselves as childlike and they see others as powerful. Well, someone with narcissistic personality disorder would agree. They would say, yes, I am powerful and you are a child, I should be in charge. So you have the dominant and subservient relationships between the two. So some of these personality traits or disorders actually magnetize towards each other and result in codependent relationships. Then the obsessive compulsive personality disorder. This is different, or sorry, yeah, personality disorder is different from the anxiety disorder. Okay, remember with OCD, you have a fear of something happening, like a fear of germs, and so you obsessively wash your hands or do something a certain number of times. With obsessive personality disorder, this is where you have to have everything a certain way. That's where you see like the orderly, like the desk, everything's in the right place, or the hangers are exactly 1 inch apart. They conform rigidly to rules. There is no shades of gray. It's just clear black and white. It either is or it isn't, that sort of mentality. Okay. So we're just going to go through the paranoid personality disorder and the histrionic and narcissistic personality disorder before we end out for today. So with paranoid personality disorder, it's exactly what it sounds like. You think people are out to get you. Not that you're having hallucinations about it, but more so that you just think that people are inherently trying to take advantage of you. Now, this is more commonly seen in men than in women. And remember, this has to be something that is consistent, not just oh, one time I don't trust that guy who's, following down the street one time, but really seeing that kind of threat everywhere. Does anyone need this slide? You do for a second? Okay. The next personality disorder with histrionic personality disorder, I just kind of think Michael Scott. Y'all know Michael Scott from The Office? Okay. He wants all the attention. He behaves inappropriately, makes all the that's what she said jokes, like he makes like the sexual innuendo jokes all the time. He wants everybody to pay attention to him, and he has extreme emotion. So this is what I think of when I think the histrionic personality disorder. So even though this is overdiagnosed in women, okay, clearly we see some examples of people from the male gender showing these same behaviors. As opposed to narcissistic personality disorder, which is, I think that I'm more important than everybody else, and I should be treated as such. All right, narcissistic personality, that's the last one we're going to talk about. This is where you believe you're more important than you are, to the point that you think everybody should treat you in that way. Now, what's interesting about this is the etiology of how is it that a person develops narcissistic personality disorder? Well, in childhood, it could be a result of being given too much attention. So like helicopter parents, your parents are telling you that you're the best thing ever and that everyone should treat you like you are, versus your parents not paying attention to you. Okay, so it's two ends of the spectrum, either paying too much attention to your child and not letting them develop any skills for themselves and expect everything to be handed to them, like a little bit bratty, versus completely ignoring them and giving them the cold shoulder so that they turn and look for that kind of boost to their self-esteem of, I need people to pay attention to me and to treat me like I'm special. Now, the last time that we met, we were talking about personality disorders. We talked about histrionic disorder, narcissistic personality disorder. We talked about the 10 different categories of these disorders, and now we're getting into the more detail about them. Okay, so the next thing that was on our list was borderline personality disorder. Now, this is the one that people always confuse with bipolar. Okay, just yesterday, somebody told me, oh, so-and-so is so bipolar. 1 minute they're happy and excited, and then the next moment they're screaming your head off or biting your head off, all of this stuff. And I'm like, actually, that's borderline personality disorder, not bipolar. Y'all may remember that with bipolar disorder, it's where you have manic phases or manic episodes for extended periods of time, not just like, oh, 1 hour you're in a manic phase and then the next hour you're in a depressive phase, but more so lasting for weeks or even months. Okay, borderline personality is when you rapidly cycle through those emotions. Okay, so with this, you have instability in your relationships. It's profound instability in your affect, meaning your emotions, instability in your self schema or your sense of self, and instability in your relationships, particularly people with BPD cycle back between devalidation and idealization. Okay, meaning that in the idealistic phase, they put people up on a pedestal and they think that they're awesome and they're all lovey-dovey, you know, love bombing and all of that. Then they move to the devaluation stage of the relationship, where they start treating that significant other like they're not important. Okay, so moving back and forth. So if you're in a relationship with someone with untreated borderline personality disorder, then you may have that Jekyll and Hyde sort of relationship, where 1 minute things are great and then the next minute things are tense and you're walking on eggshells. Okay. People with BPD also tend to have poor self-esteem, which leads to a high propensity for self-harming behavior. Okay, so like behaviors like cutting behaviors or drug and alcohol abuse. And they can make some pretty complicated decisions when it comes to impulses. So you have a higher rate of self-harm, a higher rate of self-mutilation, higher rates of childhood abuse. And basically you get this idea of thinking that is split. Okay, it's split between black and white. So in the image that y'all see on the PDF, here you see that splitting. You see that change in their personality. At the top, she's talking with a child and showing her 2 different shoes and then hugging her and is all affectionate. You know, that's the idealization part of the personality in the relationship. Then in the next, she's getting angry, yelling at her phone, and then throws a flower pot, just yeets it across the room. Okay, so you have unstable, emotional, volatile states, unstable relationships, and poor impulse control. That stems towards devaluation of yourself, but also devaluation of others as you go back and forth between those relationships. Does that make sense so far? Okay, so this is the one that people most often get confused with bipolar disorder. So it's important to note that with borderline personality disorder, the emotions are very unstable and volatile. With bipolar disorder, you have extended periods of time when someone's in a manic episode or in a depressive episode. Okay, the other personality disorder that we're going to cover is antisocial personality disorder. Now, a lot of people get this confused by saying that, oh, antisocial means like you're an introvert or you're shy. That is not at all what antisocial personality disorder means. Okay, this disorder is when you lack the ability to feel empathy or sympathy for others. What's the difference between sympathy and empathy? Yes, Terrence.
Sympathy is like this, you can feel bad for a person, like situation, like it feels like you actually feel how they feel. Or like you can relate.
Exactly right. Sympathy is when you know that something bad has happened to that person, so you're sorry that it happened, but you may not know what that experience is like. Like if you have a friend whose parents are going through a divorce and your parents haven't gone through a divorce, then you can be like, I can sympathize with you, but I don't know what it's like. Okay. If you empathize, then that means you've gone through that experience or you're familiar with that experience. And so you're able to understand it on a deeper level. Okay. With antisocial personality, sociopaths and psychopaths, they lack that ability. Okay. They have a lack of conscience. They can do wrong because they don't feel any feelings of shame or guilt or empathy towards others that they may have wronged. Okay, and so they don't understand that basic fundamental of human emotions of shame and guilt, okay, to monitor their behavior. So now their behavior is based entirely on what they want and if they can get it. So sometimes this behavior can be adaptive. We do see a high percentage of CEOs falling on the antisocial spectrum of sociopathy. Remember, just because someone has antisocial personality disorder does not mean that they're a criminal or that they're going to hurt people on purpose or that they're going to be violent or eat people like Jeffrey Dahmer, okay? It simply means that they lack the ability to feel the same emotions of empathy and guilt. So they can learn those emotions. They can learn how to blend in and how to function in society like others, but they still lack the genuine experience of those emotions. Okay, so not everyone who is a sociopath is going to like try to kill you or try to assault you or something. Okay, so like many famous billionaires are sociopaths because they have what it takes to make the decisions that make them money, even if it costs other people or causes other people stress or unfortunate events. Okay. They also fail to conform to social norms and to laws. So they fail to conform to society as a whole, hence the term antisocial. It doesn't have to do with their personality being friendly or outgoing. It has to do with whether or not they can function within society, or do they end up breaking society's rules. Okay, so with that lack of remorse and guilt, they can become very deceitful or irresponsible. They can be aggressive or fearless and tend to exploit others. So we do see a higher percentage of sociopaths in the criminal population as well, but not all sociopaths are criminal. Now, the differentiation between sociopath and psychopath is that psychopaths are a small subset of sociopaths. Most sociopaths are not violent individuals. Okay, they're more like white collar crime, fraud, things like that, dealing with money because they can benefit from it. Think about the cost risk analysis. If you murder somebody, there's big risk in that. You could go to jail. You don't get a lot out of it. But if you like steal people's pensions, it's less likely that you're going to go away to jail for life. Okay, so most sociopaths are going to deal in those non-violent crimes. But there's a small subset of them known as psychopaths. Okay, so murderers like Charles Manson. He tried to instigate a race war known as Helter Skelter, where he had a family murdered by his cult followers. I think he died in prison recently. He also got married in prison, which is like, who? Like, there are just some people that just write to serial killers and they're like, hey, how you spell your number? So slide into the DMs of a sociopath. And other famous serial killers like Ted Bundy, although Ted Bundy probably had more of a narcissistic personality disorder coupled with an antisocial personality disorder. John Wayne Gacy, all of these different things where they basically have expressed, when people have studied their brains and studied, why they did what they did, they've expressed that they lack the ability to feel what others feel. Okay, and so that allows them to engage in antisocial behavior. Now, this personality disorder is going to be more common in men than in women. I think it's less than 1% of the population are female sociopaths, so it's much more commonly found in the male gender. Yes, Ted Bundy. If y'all have seen I think it's a Netflix movie with Zac Efron. I think it's on the list for your project. But he would trick women into helping him. Like, basically he would act injured. Like, he would have like a plaster cast on his arm and he would go up to women and be like, hey, can you help me do this? Because I can't load it into my car. And then he'd kidnap them and kill them and assault them. But this whole idea of Ted Bundy as like some smoke show who was able to like charm young women into following him or whatever, like, that's not true. He was not a smoke show, first of all. And it's more so that he went up to women with, a vulnerability. Okay, he went up to them and was like, hey, I need help. And they were like, oh, okay, sure. It wasn't like he rolled up and was like, hey, get in my car. And they were like, what could go wrong? Also with the idea that he was some sort of mastermind and that's how he was able to evade the police. Actually, the police kind of messed up a number of times with him. Like, he literally jumped out of a window at a jail and ran away, and he was out for like a couple of weeks. And he crossed state lines when he committed these crimes. And at this point in time, different jurisdictions didn't compare and contrast their crime scenes and their MOs. And so they thought that they were all unrelated. And so because he crossed those state lines, he was able to get away with it for as long as he did. Okay. He also represented himself in court. Not a good look. He was not very skilled at it. And the judge, however, was very, very sympathetic to him. He was like, you would have made a great lawyer, and I would have loved to have you practice in my court. This is just such a waste that this is what you did with your life. But it was just like, what about the victims that he literally murdered? And it's like, no, the judge was like very sympathetic towards Ted Bundy. So a little problematic there. But there's this whole glamorization of him as like some macho, guy who was charming. And it's like, actually, no, he was just, he had a unibrow. I don't know if maybe you're into that. So I get some tweezers. As to why sociopaths and psychopaths lack the ability to feel empathy, it's tied to lower levels of gray matter. Y'all may remember that gray matter does a lot of the functioning in your brain when it comes to processing with your neurons. So we see this biological link. Here we see PET scans showing the activity in the brain that shows that in a murderer's frontal cortex, they have less activity. Okay, what does your frontal lobe do in your brain? Yeah, it helps with thinking, it helps with making decisions, it helps with judgments. Okay, and so if you have decreased activity in your frontal lobe, then that's going to mean that you're going to be more impulsive, okay, that you're not going to restrain yourself as often. Okay, so we do see that kind of problematic behavior. Now, there is no cure for antisocial personality disorder. Okay, there's no way to implant them with a new limbic system that can make them process emotions like empathy and sympathy and regret and shame and guilt. Okay, it's simply not possible. However, this does not mean that we cannot work with a prognosis or work with different therapies in order to decrease the harm that could come from this disorder. So with therapy, a person with sociopathy can learn how to blend in. They can learn how to be effective mimics so that they don't ostracize themselves from others, or they can learn the difference between right and wrong logically, okay, even if they can't feel it intuitively, right? And so these therapies can help with promoting that sort of behavior, even if the thought process isn't genuine. Okay, so a lot of people with sociopathy can be very charming and charismatic. They can get people to follow them. They can become like cult leaders. And it's because they're able to mimic other people's feelings without having to suffer, the actual feelings themselves. Okay. So cognitive therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy, this is dealing with listening to people's thoughts and how they think and why they think the way that they do. So explaining to someone with sociopathy how their behavior affects other people, and not necessarily saying, oh, well, it's not because you don't want to hurt other people, but more so saying, look at how this could negatively affect you. Okay, if you cause harm to somebody else, like you steal from them, then you could get caught, you could go to jail. So maybe you should change your behavior to not steal things because of the consequences. So it's more black and white rather than moral. Okay. The humanistic therapy, the ideal of ideal self versus real self, that might not be as effective because of the lack of those fundamental emotions. And then psychoanalytic therapy with free association, just basically talking about what's in your head to put it into words and then able to raise your unconscious and subconscious to the conscious level. In terms of medication that can be used to treat personality disorders, anti-anxiety drugs can be very helpful with borderline personality disorder because of the issues with low self-esteem and ineffective judgment making and decision making. It can slow the brain down, so it can help with those kind of manic behaviors that result in borderline personality disorder. So Xanax, Ativan, Valium, all of those types of benzos act as depressants on the sympathetic nervous system. With avoidant personality disorder, which anxiety is a big part of avoidant personality disorder, this is going to be particularly helpful. But again, treatment always varies. There's no one set treatment for anything in the DSM. It's very open-ended because it's not one size fits all. Now, the issue with the biomedical approach is that you have a high risk of addiction, both physical addiction and psychological addiction, using these benzos as a coping mechanisms to shut down your emotions, or if you're prescribed antidepressants like SSRIs, if you try to go off of those SSRIs, you can go through a period of withdrawal. Now, serotonin withdrawal is not fun. You basically feel like a wet paper towel. You can't feel anything other than just a heaviness. You don't want to move. You feel nauseous. You get headaches. So it's just like if you're going through a withdrawal for a drug, okay? But your brain is reacting to the lack of that serotonin inhibitor. And so that's going to lead to some negative side effects. So it's always important not to quit your medication cold turkey. Okay, be consistent with the medication. And if you feel like you want to change the medication, then you need to make sure that it's done under a doctor's care, because suicidal ideation can also increase with drastic changes in this biomedical model. So if you're on a medication like a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, and then you stop taking it suddenly, that can mess up your mood even more. So it's important to have a doctor's care with that. Are we good so far? Okay, so looking at the percentage of Americans who have ever experienced psychological disorders, this breaks it down by ethnicity as well as by gender. Okay, for the most part, you're going to see women having a higher rate of experience with psychological disorders, with the exception of addiction. Okay, addiction are going to have a much higher percentage in the male gender for addiction. Then with ethnicity, okay, you're going to see that even though the white population makes up the majority of the, at least the United States population, you see that people of color suffer a lot of symptoms and experiences with mental illness. Okay, this could be a sociocultural model. If you look at things like alcohol abuse, dependence, or anxiety, phobias, all of that could relate to having to deal with the stressors of racism or socioeconomic inequality. Okay, so that could play a role in the social cultural model of things like depression and anxiety. Okay, so is there anything interesting that you note on this chart as it relates to the differences in gender and ethnicity? One thing that I found interesting was looking at the antisocial personality disorder, the difference between men and women. Okay, 4.5% of the male population has been diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, compared with 0.8% of women that have been diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. It'd be interesting to see also the levels of diagnoses with narcissistic personality disorder versus histrionic personality disorder, since women tend to be diagnosed more with the histrionic personality disorder and men tend to be diagnosed more as narcissists. Are we good so far? Okay, that link no longer works. I had made it for a Wellness Wednesday activity, but it's no longer there. Schizoid personality disorder. This is when somebody exhibits eccentric or odd behaviors. They can be emotionless or disengaged. My favorite example of this is Gollum from Lord of the Rings. Y'all know the guy that goes like, "My precious." Okay, he's very eccentric. He lives in a cave and he eats fish raw. Okay, so he's going to fall under this category of schizoid. Okay, odd behaviors, eccentric behaviors, disengaging from others, although he does have some extreme emotions when he talks to himself in the movie with the different personalities that he has. Within the Schoology page on Unit 8, I have this activity for y'all to complete if you want to rate yourself on the major traits of narcissism. It's like a little quiz, like the personality quiz that you took for Wellness Wednesday that one time. Remember that the main characteristics of someone with a narcissistic personality disorder is a lack of empathy, an inflated self-image, inflated self-worth, a deep need for attention and adoration and affection, and an inability to handle criticism. Okay, so this is a little bit different from sociopaths. Like with antisocial personality disorder, the narcissists do show a decreased ability to feel empathy for others, but they also are more attention seeking with that. Okay, so they want to be the center of attention. They want to be the most important person in the room, and you can't criticize them or else they will fly off the handle. Okay, so some extreme emotions there. Now, don't feel like you have to take this quiz. If you don't want to, you don't have to, but it is available in the Schoology lecture unit if you want. Avoidant personality disorder is exactly what it sounds like. They avoid contact with other people. Now, it's not because they want to be alone. It's not because they hate other people or they don't want to have relationships with other people. They want to interact with others, but they don't because they fear looking foolish or they fear being rejected. So it's this fear of rejection. It's these feelings of inadequacy that leads to their behavior of closing themselves off from others. Okay, so anxiety is a major symptom of this particular personality disorder. Are we good so far? Also within the Schoology page, I have this case study video on schizophrenia. We find a higher population of men, particularly homeless men, suffer from schizophrenia. And so this is an interesting little case study for y'all to watch in your free time, which, speaking of, it looks like we will have some of that for this class period. So we're supposed to get out at 11:45, but instead of moving on to the next unit on therapies, we're just going to end here for today.